Good morning. I'm Tom Bannon. I'm the CEO of the California Apartment Association. I'm here to welcome you to today's webinar press conference on the economic conditions of renters in California and beyond, a report commissioned by the California Apartment Association and prepared by Beacon Economics. This webinar is being recorded, and once the recording is available, we'll send you details on how you can listen. After the session, we invite you to visit the CA website, canet.org, to read the report. We'll have an article about the report on the homepage and a link to the PDF. This report focuses on the financial health of the state's renters prior to COVID-19 pandemic, during the pandemic, and moving forward as California reopens and the economy rebounds. Prior to discussing the report, I would be remiss not to address the debate that is currently underway in the California State Legislature regarding the current statewide eviction moratorium. Unfortunately, there is serious consideration to extending the moratorium through the year. Candidly, any extension of the moratorium is a result of local and state governments not expediting the disbursement of millions of dollars in a timely fashion to residents and housing providers who are in great need of these funds. Many housing providers have gone without rent payments for over a year, but they still have expenses. CA's position is we don't want any extension of the eviction moratorium. We want state and local governments to expedite the disbursement of the funds that are available. It is unconscionable that less than 15% of the billions of dollars earmarked in California have not been dispersed. If the legislature is going to extend the moratorium, there's a couple things that have to happen. One, the extension has to be short term. However, California has got to figure a way, and local governments, to expedite the funds out to the tenants and the housing providers. Also going forward, the tenant protections under Senate Bill 91 must only apply to renters who are most in need, people with verifiable financial hardships, those that have filed the COVID-19 pandemic affidavit. Unfortunately, thousands of renters are abusing the system. We're talking about people who had the ability to pay or kept working full-time throughout the pandemic, but quit paying rent because they knew the moratorium would make it difficult to proceed with an eviction. This cannot continue. So, look, the issue is relatively extreme. I would urge all of you to continue to watch the canet.org website for what you can do to bring some practical resolution to this issue. Anyway, so this does bring us to the real reason for this webinar. We are here today. We have asked Beacon Economics to look at the financial health of the state's renters and the state of California's economics. We believe this information is critical for elected officials as they contemplate legislation that to address the needs of tenants and housing providers and the rest of Californians. A little bit about Beacon Economics. Founded in 2007, Beacon Economics entered the spotlight as one of the earliest and most adamant forecasters of the subprime mortgage market meltdown, and as one of a handful of organizations to stand against the tide and correctly calculate the depth and breadth of the global financial and economic crisis that followed. The accurateness of its economic forecasting has helped establish Beacon as one of California's most reputable economic firms. So, without further ado, here to discuss the study is Dr. Christopher Thornburg, founding partner at Beacon Economics. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that introduction, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to have the ability to chat with you this morning. And as noted, Tom and the California Apartment Association came to us a few weeks ago and basically asked us about the status, as noted, of California's renters and really renters in general. Now, this is obviously an important question from a policy standpoint, and I think it also leads directly to what I would call one of the oddities of the recovery we're in right now. And it really boils down to what I would call two amazingly, even wildly different opinions about where our economy is today. Let me kind of give you a couple examples. These are some recent headlines I've pulled in this month. These are all from June of this particular year. Here's one. Workers in 25 states brace for early unemployment shutoff. I have 88 cents in my bank account. In other words, this shutting off is obviously considered to be a massive problem by some parts of the policy wonk arena. On the other hand, job openings set a record of 9.3 million in May of this year, April or May. I think it might be April numbers because it's a little bit lagged, which of course is the record number. Never have we had more job openings. Equivalently, not too long ago, a group called Policy Linked released a study suggesting that 900,000 households in California, we're talking about 10% overall of all households, 20% of all renters are behind on rent. And that they're up to, and their debt levels have gone through the roof, which again, incredibly dismal predictions. On the other hand, a recent study in Bloomberg points out that California defies doom with #1 US economy. So needless to say, if you're a reporter or just an average person in your kitchen looking at these headlines, you have to wonder what is actually going on out there. What is the real economy doing? Now, of course, what's going on out there, broadly speaking, is that the incredible political divide that's in our nation that has so profoundly impacted politics over the last 6-7 years is obviously having an enormous impact on our interpretation of the economic data. What I'm going to try to do today is take a step away from the politics, if you will, of these interpretations and kind of give you a bunch of actual just data points for you to contemplate, to think about where we are as an economy. And when I make these points to you, there's a few big themes that come out of this. First of all, when we start thinking about the pre-pandemic economy, the US economy in 2019 was nothing like the economy in 2007. Indeed, while growth was relatively slow in 2019, the reality was the fundamentals of the US economy were actually very, very good. Indeed, better than a normal year and significantly better than where we were in that incredibly overheated, distended economy that led into the Great Recession. In other words, we were a lot better able to handle some sort of economic storm than we were back then. Second big theme, and this is something that's been woven in all my presentations over the last last year or so, is while we have to acknowledge that COVID is a truly tragic natural disaster. I mean, millions of people have lost their lives, millions of families are mourning the loss of loved ones or are dealing with long-run health complications. On the other hand, the history of natural disasters, which is what this is, shows us that as tragic as they are for populations in the short run, they tend not to have long-run economic consequences the same way, for example, that a more traditional source of a business cycle, such as a collapsing financial bubble, has on the economy. In other words, we were anticipating a relatively quick recovery compared to the last couple. Now, with that in mind, again, going back to the politics of the day, the politics created a situation whereby the two parties, Democrats and Republicans, Washington, D.C., more or less were competing with each other as to who could throw the most stimulus at the economy. Now, that's completely different than in, say, 2008 and 2009, where one side of the debate basically put the foot on the brake pedal of stimulus. This time around, they both, at the same time, had their foot on the gas pedal of stimulus. The net result of that was one of the most over-the-top stimulus programs we've ever seen. $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus alone, with, of course, spending money going straight to American households at a 3-to-1 pace relative to actual income losses. So enormous amount. And this, of course, is going to mean an even more rapid recovery. And as you'll see in just a second, I would almost argue that right now the recovery is already finished. By the end of this particular quarter that we're in right now, to that point, the output gap, which began in the first quarter of last year, and by the second quarter was the largest we'd ever seen in the United States, well, that is completely closed. What that means is this recession, which was at its outset only about 6 weeks long, has now fully recovered in just a short 6 quarters. Yes, we are done with the recession. Now, to contrast it getting into the Great Recession, which took 9 years from the beginning of the downturn to the actual closure of the rest of the output gap, 9 years in total. Now, with this all in mind, look, there's no doubt that some households out there, some renting households, even in California, particularly in California maybe, are still suffering today. We can't deny that. This has been a tumultuous period, and there's certainly a degree of folks that are still trying to find their way forward. But with that in mind, when we take a look at the aggregate statistics at the national or state level, you don't find an economic situation that would back up the prediction that 900,000 households in California are behind on rent and facing eviction. Quite the opposite. Things look remarkably strong for the overall labor force and in particular for renters. Again, because of the nature of the business cycle and the nature of our economy at the beginning of this. This suggests that worries about eviction are really largely overblown. And then what that suggests ultimately is that national and local policy leaders should be focused not so much on what I would call these fire hose type measures, where they are just liberally using broad-based policies to deal with situations that are very, very narrow at this particular point in time. Rather, they should be focused on very narrow levels of stimulus and relief to help that small set of households that are still struggling, while of course they start to prepare for the next expansion, which we are going to be entering into the second half of this particular year. And in particular, focusing on the big challenge in California's future, which is a lack of labor force, in turn made worse by the lack of housing supply. Obviously, thinking about eviction moratoriums moves us in the exact opposite direction from that particular long-run need for the state. Now, that's a lot of points, and I don't even want to take 10, 15 minutes of your time this morning. So I'm going to bolt through a bunch of data. As already noted, both our report and this presentation will be made available to you so you can peruse this data on your own time. And if you have any questions, of course, you can always reach out to us at Beacon Economics. So where are we now? On the left-hand side, the purple line on top is what we call either real GDP or the forecasted trend of real GDP had we not had any kind of downturn. The orange line is what's actually happened. And yes, there's no doubt. You can see, of course, that big downturn that began at the very beginning of this. But within weeks of that initial downturn, we began to mitigate the situation. And eventually, of course, the vaccines are being rolled out and we're getting control over this virus. And the California economy recently reopened. In the meantime, the output gap closed rapidly to just about 2.4% coming into the second quarter. And by the way, we're anticipating a 9 to 10% growth in the second quarter, which more or less closes the rest of the output gap. In other words, the US economy is truly recovered. Now, it isn't an even recovery. This is one of the reasons why some households are still suffering, while on the other hand, some households are doing great. Take a look on the left-hand side, for example, in the distribution of real consumer spending. One of the reasons that this business cycle was so different from the last business cycle was the last business cycle was characterized by a collapse in wealth, which in turn created a general decline in consumer demand across the entire economy. It was a traditional demand shock. This time around, it was a traditional supply shock. That is to say, people stopped going to restaurants and entertainment facilities and recreation and theme parks last year, not because they couldn't afford to the way they couldn't afford to in 2009 or 10, but because they weren't able to. They were closed because, of course, of the virus itself. Now, this is an incredibly important distinction because when you talk about a supply shock, what that does is it takes the demand that would have gone to those sectors that were closed and pushes it elsewhere. Right now in the United States and in California, we continue to see service sectors such as restaurants and hotels still behind the curve, still struggling to get back to where they were pre-pandemic. But sales on the goods side of the economy, automobiles, sporting goods, hardware, food and beverage, autos, all these are way above trend. And indeed, these parts of the economy remain on fire. And you can see, of course, that above normal demand in the production numbers. Industrial production has bounced back. In fact, the biggest problem in industrial production right now in the United States is not a lack of demand for the products they produce, but the lack of inputs. And of course, the enormous increase in input costs. We actually have seen some wobbles in production because of the lack of inputs here. And on the right-hand side, you can see how low inventory to sales ratios are for retail overall and for the auto sector in particular. In other words, this frenetic pace of trying to catch up to meet the excessive consumer demand is nowhere near over. It will continue to heat this economy over the course of the next year. And this, of course, brings me to the labor markets, because you'd say, well, hang on a second. The economy is just about caught up to where it should be. You're talking about things like auto sector doing great, yet our basic read of the numbers suggests that employment is down about 7 million jobs. Payroll employment is down about 7.6 million jobs. The unemployment rate is still elevated. Now, mind you, it's come down a lot, but it's still elevated relative to where we were pre-pandemic. How can we square these two ideas that the labor market looks so far from recovery, where, of course, the actual real part of economic output is booming along at a great pace? Well, again, it goes back to the idea of supply versus demand. When you think about this lack of employment growth, one of the questions is it because there are simply no jobs for workers? Or is it because there's just so many jobs openings, but there's not enough workers to fill them right now, despite what looks, of course, to be some excess supply of unemployed workers? Well, indeed, if you take a look at the left-hand side here, this is job openings in the US economy. And what you see, of course, is a situation by which job openings exceeded 9 million in April of this particular year. This is a crazy number, 2 million more than it was pre-pandemic. Now, what's going on? Well, remember, some of this is the fact that the sectors that are booming right now tend not to be the sectors that people have been released from. In other words, there's some skill mismatches. There's also the argument about who's truly unemployed looking for a new job versus, of course, the number of people who are still on temporary layoff, which is about 1 million. Yes, we do have high unemployment payments, which, of course, is supporting households and giving them an opportunity, shall we say, to find a good job, the right job for them. Now, I know the story is that too much unemployment payments prevents people from working. They don't want to work. But I would argue it's not so much they don't want to work as much as it is, I don't want to work here. When you give people lots of support, it gives them an opportunity to find the right kind of job for them. Of course, you also have a situation where a lot of people actually retired at the beginning of this. They said, hey, I'm hearing about this Great Depression. Well, if there's a Great Depression, I might as well go ahead and take my retirement right now. And a lot of folks did that. And then this is all on top, of course, of labor force challenges having to do with long-run demographics. That is to say, right now in the United States, the demographics is shifting to the point where the number of people who are in their prime working years is actually declining. So what this all says to me is the problems in the labor market are not a function of labor demand. There's tremendous amount of labor demand out there. It's a lack of labor supply. And to put this in a little bit of context, think of it this way. We're down about 7.5 million payroll household jobs, but there's only about 4 million additional unemployed. Remember, there's always going to be about 3.5 million people, 4 million people who are unemployed. It's called frictional unemployment. Even prior to it, when we had the tightest labor market in 50 years, there were 3.5 million people employed. Of these 4 million people, 1 million people are still in temporary layoff. Of course, the big decline in labor force turns out over 60% have opted for early retirement. These folks are simply not looking for a job at all. And what this means is these 9.2 million job openings are there for 3 million workers, 3 million additional workers with about 1.5 million potential reentrants. We are up to our eyeballs in jobs right now, and there's just not enough workers to, of course, fill them. And you can see, again, the long run problem on the left with the lack of growth in people in the prime labor force. And you can see how confident workers are. Take a look at the number of quits on the right-hand side. This is one of the issues that employers are dealing with. It's not just filling current spots, but people are opting to leave. And that is, again, because they have options, they have choices, because they're in a good economic situation. It's completely different than what we were dealing with at the back end of the Great Recession, when there was a lack of labor demand. And of course, overall situation for workers was quite bad. And California's situation is intensified by our lack of housing. The fact that we have incredibly tight housing market driven by decades of a lack of housing construction, leading to, of course, record numbers of Californians leaving the state simply because there's no place for them to call home. On top of all this situation, of course, also comes that massive stimulus, the $5 trillion plus, the huge amount of unemployment payments. Remember what I said, there's about 3 million additional unemployed in the United States right now. Yet coming into just the last few weeks, there are about 15 million unemployment checks continuing to go out to the US economy. Now, some of those unemployment checks overlap. In other words, depending on what kind of program you're in, as an unemployed person, you may be getting multiple checks. But just think about that. 3 million additional unemployed, 15 million unemployment checks going on. It gives you some sense of the overreaction of the federal government. On the left-hand side, the yellow line is government transfers to households. The actual blue line is the actual hit to compensation, which wasn't all that bad. It has left us with a situation by which American households have something on the order of $2 trillion in excess savings right now. Not normal growth in savings, excess savings, $2 trillion, a phenomenal amount of money. This is leading to a phenomenal degree of new demand in our economy, and candidly is going to take this economy and overheat it for the next couple of years. We're not going to just recover by the second quarter of the year. We're going to go above trend for the next year, year and a half. This is an economy with plenty of dry powder. It's going to continue to cruise along. Now, what does this all mean for renters? And this, of course, goes right to the heart of this paper we just finished for the California apartment situation. And the paper basically backs up a lot of these points, such as, for example, renters were actually in a much better position prior to the pandemic than they were prior to the Great Recession. Take a look on the left-hand side. This is pre-tax income for median renters that actually has been growing at a fairly steady basis. 2019 was actually a very, very good year overall for renters in the United States and in California. On the right-hand side, they weren't dealing with a lot of financial cost or debt burdens, both because of a lack of new credit accumulation plus low interest rates has led to a situation by which the share of renters with an over 40% debt ratio had fallen close to an all-time low level. Other ways you could see the health of renters coming into the pandemic. On the left-hand side, median rent to income in California for renters, which despite, of course, the panic and part of a lot of policymakers in California had actually been going down. I appreciate that over and over you've heard how much faster rents have risen than incomes, but they're comparing apples and oranges in that comparison. They're doing so on purpose because, of course, it creates a worse situation than what's actually happening. On this data on the left-hand side, you could see that the median rent to income ratio actually peaked out in 2011, 2012, and has been falling ever since. Still high relative to the rest of the United States. There's no doubt that if you live in California, you have to deal with a higher rent burden than most, but it has been coming down. And of course, late rent was at a very low period coming into 2019, again, because of the status of renters. Now, here, like other places, you continue to see what I would call a lagging labor market recovery. Overall, we're short 1 million jobs from where we were pre-pandemic. The number of California renters who are unemployed still remains at about 10%. It's come down a lot, but still high from a long run standpoint. But again, this is more of a labor supply issue than a labor demand issue. And one of the places you could see that is by contrasting, by looking at the trends in wages coming over the last year or so. On the left-hand side, earnings growth by level of education. In the middle, earnings growth by hours, whether you're full-time or part-time. On the right-hand side, wage gains by where you are in the income distribution. And I'm comparing the first, which is lowest income workers, to the fourth, which are the higher income ones. Now, what do all these pictures show us? Well, I'm sure you've heard on and on about the quote unquote K-shaped recovery. The K-shaped recovery is the idea that low income folks, that is to say, primarily renters, see slower economic recovery than high income folks, high skilled folks. But while they like to say that out loud, and by the way, it's pretty much true for most recessions, this is the least K-shaped recovery we've ever seen. Indeed, the interpretation of this recovery as being K-shaped is largely incorrect. On the left-hand side, for example, those with a high school degree over the course of the last year have seen their income gains basically on par with those of bachelor degree and more. There hasn't been a big hit to this group. In the middle, Those who are part-time have actually seen their wages, their earnings increase over the course of the last year relative to those who are full-time. And of course, on the right-hand side, the biggest wage gains are for those in the lowest quartile of income. Now, this all goes back to the basic idea that while some workers, and again, those service sectors are still out there and probably some of them are having a tough time, those who continue to be employed are having record hours and record pay gains. Whether you're working at an auto shop, whether you're working at a local Home Depot, whether you're working at a warehouse, you're getting record hours and record pay bumps because your employers are just struggling to meet demand for their products through those warehouses and stores and various sorts of facilities. Indeed, if you've remained in the labor market, you've had a very good year and a half, which is so different than the last couple of recessions. And you can see this elsewhere in the data. On the left-hand side, you can see that California's low-income spending has been rising faster than high-income spenders. Now, this isn't to say we should feel bad for high-income households, only that a lot of their spending is still constrained, of course, by the pandemic and the fact that a lot of parts of our economy are constrained either by health restrictions or equivalently by the inability to hire people to fill particular positions. But you can see how strong the spending is at that lowest income level, again, primarily renters. And on the right-hand side, you can see the bottom three quartiles in California, not only were doing quite well, but they were doing better than the US overall. The labor shortage issues are more acute here. And as a result of that, lower income workers, again, primarily renters, have been doing quite well. On the left-hand side, you've heard all about the debt buildup. Yet, according to data from the Federal Reserve Board of Dallas, average checking account balances for the bottom 50% of earners, again, primarily renters. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to California. The data wasn't that cut down, but it actually has jumped by over 100% since the start of the pandemic. This is unemployment payments and stimulus checks and everything else. It's gone from about $1,500 to $3,500, so a huge increase. And of course, on the right-hand side, yes, people are not paying rent at some level. We know it's a little bit increased from where it was, but of course, that's true for all renters, not just low-income ones. Again, what you see going on, in fact, it's surprising how many high-income renters are not paying their rent right now, which of course goes back to the basic idea that there may be some strategic situation going on here. Yes, some renters may not be paying because they can't pay, but renters may also be choosing not to pay because they don't want to. And there's other data out there that suggests that the biggest problem when renting is for single family homes. Now, again, that's pretty strategic. If you don't pay rent for a couple of years, you can save up enough for a good down payment. So what does this all mean? Where does this lead us? Well, look, as already noted, the labor market slow recovery is not a function of labor demand. It's a function of labor supply. That's incredibly important because what it means is the complete opposite of what happened post-Great Recession, where workers got clobbered. This time around, workers, again, have great opportunities. They have money in the bank, and they are taking their time to find that next job. And that's great. It's not a problem. It's good for workers at all skill levels. It's going to reduce inequality issues ultimately. And yes, I know there are those who say that too much stimulus payment is simply encouraging people to not work. But again, there's a difference between I don't want to work versus I don't want to work here. And a lot of this is I don't want to work here. They're looking for that right job. Now, of course, this is bad for businesses and bad for consumers in the short run. There's no doubt about it. We're certainly seeing it in the inflation rate at the moment, of course, driven by the lack of capacity in our economy, and in turn driven by a lack of workers. But ultimately, businesses will catch up. They're going to have to figure out productivity gains, productivity improvements. They're going to have to figure out how to restructure their organizations in a way to deal with these long-run labor supply issues. But in the very short run, it suggests that workers and renting workers in particular are doing very, very well right now. And for those who are unemployed, there's plenty of job opportunities available for them. Let's help those folks get retrained and start filling some of those jobs. As for the status of California renters, as I've already noted, there's little doubt that a portion of these folks are struggling. But as you can see, given the limited data we have available to us at this point in time, overall things look surprisingly good. Now, as time goes on and we get better surveys, such as the American Community Survey and some of the deeper data sets, I'm almost assured that we'll continue to get more and more evidence about just how strong the renters of California are at this particular point in time. And this, of course, in turn suggests that the apocalyptic predictions of evictions are highly overblown, highly overblown. It just doesn't make sense to suggest that these many renters can't pay when you look at the strength of the economy, look at the strength of the labor market for these workers. And this in turn suggests that policymakers should take a step back from these fire hose efforts to just do general stimulus, general relief across the economy. This isn't needed now. The economy has recovered. We have tons of dry powder. Focus efforts on near relief targeted at the small share of truly struggling households that are out there. Fire hose efforts are counterproductive at this particular point in time. It's time to think about what next. And that's, again, where I'm coming down on this thing. Look, our economy is going to remain heated for the next couple of years. It's time for us to manage the next expansion rather than worrying about the last recession. And that, of course, means, as opposed to worrying about evictions, which are not the problem they're being predicted to be, rather they should be focused on the more important issue for California, and that is housing supply. We desperately need housing to allow people to move to this wonderful state, which in turn will allow our businesses to continue to expand and compete globally the way we know they can. But they need the workers, and the workers need the roofs. And focusing on expanding housing supply is diametrically opposite to the kind of policies that the state has been leaning towards over the course of the last year and a half. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I appreciate that was a lot of material. As noted, we will get these out to you. And with that, why don't I go ahead and ask Tom to come back and see if there's any Q&A that people might want answered.
Yeah, sure. Chris, I think we have a couple questions. I'm going to have Mike Nemeth, our communications director, sort of read those questions to you. So,
okay.
Mike.
Well, so far we have one question. It's kind of a two-parter from Katie Licari at Capitol in Maine. She says that she noticed that the data cited was federal data and wondered if you collected or Beacon collected any state data for the report. And the second part of the question.
Let me answer that quick. Don't test my memory. So listen, actually some of the data is California and some of the data is national. The distinction has to do with the availability of data. It's as simple as that. Any place we could get data for California, such as the Opportunity Insights, which allows us to do that, we grab state level data. If it wasn't available, such as the Dallas Federal Reserve, we had to look at it at a national standpoint. So we did the best we could. Let's remember, we're still in the midst of the situation, and a lot of the necessary data is lagged. As noted, over the course of the next year, there'll be more data releases, and I am fully certain that as more data comes out, it will continue to support the point of view we put forward. And I can also guarantee that it'll continue to be misinterpreted by those whose political, shall we say, goals necessitate misinterpreting that data.
Thanks, Chris. Katie's second question has to do with rent burden. Wondering if your research looked at an increasing rent burden in California.
Well, as already noted, it hasn't been increasing. That's exactly one of the data points I showed you. Now, the best source for rental burden comes from the American Community Survey, which is the annual mini census they do. It's about a 3.3% population poll. And I showed you the data on the median rent to income in the state of California through, I think, 2018 or 2019 data. And as noted, that number had peaked in 2011 and has been falling ever since. Now, again, it's still higher than the rest of the United States, given, of course, the lack of housing supply we have here, which has led to higher housing costs. But it has not been increasing. It has actually been decreasing coming into, of course, the current situation that we're in right now.
Okay, I just got another question from Ben Vandermeer of the Sacramento Business Journal. Did the report take a look at the shortage of childcare and/or in-class education as a factor in why some renters have chosen not to take jobs?
I guess I'm a little confused by how that question is worded. As noted, the primary conversation was not sector specific, but in general, the lack of labor supply both in California as in the nation overall. Now, of course, the kind of jobs that are having the biggest problem hiring people tend to be lower income jobs, whether it's restaurants or childcare facilities. As noted, these sectors tend not to pay on par with more traditional jobs. They tend to hire low-skilled workers. But again, when you have a general lack of workers in our entire economy the way we have right now, workers have options, workers have choices. It's probably absolutely right for them to say, I'd rather not take that very low-paid job when I may very well have a career path entry-level job available to me. Because employers who may have those job openings may be willing to pick somebody they wouldn't otherwise because of the general scarcity of workers, and will give them the training to make that next step in life. Now, what does that mean for, of course, childcare and restaurants and hotels and all the places that are struggling to hire workers right now? It means two things. A, for them to deal with this situation, they're going to have to continue to increase the wages they're paying their entry-level workers, and indeed may have to revisit their entire structure of wages within their organization. In a longer-term basis, what they're going to have to start thinking about is productivity improvement, capital improvements. That is to say, for example, if you're a full-service restaurant, you may need to go fast casual, where you're literally having people order at the bar because you simply don't have enough servers. You're going to have to find different ways of doing things. And of course, you're going to have to take those higher payrolls and you're going to have to pass them on to consumers in the form of higher prices. This adjustment process is going to take a couple of years. These sectors will continue to struggle, and consumers who need these sectors will also continue to struggle to get the services they need as a result of it. So yeah, it's creating some problems in our economy, but remember, ultimately, workers are the beneficiaries of these problems, and it's going to continue to move us towards lower inequality over the course of the next couple of years. And that, I think, is one of the biggest issues I'm trying to get across here. In the post-pandemic world, we're going to see reduced inequality, not increased inequality the way we did post-Great Recession. It's an entirely different kind of business cycle with an entirely different economic and demographic outcome.
All right, thanks, Chris. Now we have, there's a comment here from Susan. Wondered about California's $78 billion surplus. Just wondered if you could comment on that and how that fits into this whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, surplus is an odd word because that surplus includes a whole bunch of money that was predicted to not show up. Again, go back to some of the incredibly dismal predictions, the apocalyptic predictions we heard at the beginning of this thing. A lot of economists describing this event as a Great Depression type event, which was completely incorrect. I mean, you couldn't be more wrong than suggesting this was a Great Depression type situation. Two, of course, the prediction from the Department of Finance last year that the state was going to face a $50 billion deficit, which again made no sense given the nature of this particular business cycle. So that quote unquote surplus you're seeing is largely a function of A, the depression not happening, and B, a ton of money that the federal government has given the state to take on various things. So it's a big surplus, quote unquote, but let's remember that the state still needs to think wisely about how it spends its money. We need to be focused on what I would call long-run budget issues rather than how much can I spend right now.
Thanks, Chris. I've got a question for Tom now. Tom, if you're ready to unmute and turn your camera. There you are.
Sure.
Okay. This question from one of the attendees is, how can we influence policymakers to listen to the facts and make reasonable policies?
Great question, Mike. What I would encourage everybody to do is you can go to caanet.org, and there's a mobilization connection there where you can communicate directly to your legislators. Part of, I think, the hope that we had by commissioning the study, and after seeing the results, that we will get legislators and their staff to actually listen to this particular report. Anything you can do to help them, that would be great. We'll actually have the report available, in a PDF version. Probably the more reports that are sent to members of the legislature and their staff, the better. So that's sort of my response to that. We obviously are working this every day, and we're anxious. We're anxious to see the results of the study and to hear Chris's presentation, and we too will be delivering this over to the legislature.
All right, thank you, Tom. About one more question here. This one's from Jeff Stone. Construction costs have skyrocketed during the pandemic. While it is broadly understood that California needs more housing, won't any new housing supply come with much higher rents?
Well, there's a couple ways of answering that. Again, there's a lot of overlay there. First of all, there's no doubt the construction costs are up, although what's interesting is they are starting to come down. For example, lumber supply is finally catching up with demand, and prices of lumber is finally starting to come down. But putting all that to one side, the cost of building housing is not the reason for our lack of housing in the state. That has to do with zoning. It has to do with permit fees. It has to do with NIMBYism. It has to do with all the efforts that started to build up in California starting in the late 90s to basically prevent new housing from being constructed, and has created this enormous hole in our housing market. Now, the second question, of course, gets to the idea that when you build a new apartment building, those tend to have high rents because they're new buildings and people can't afford this. But this, again, is one of those, what I would call conventional wisdoms. That's neither conventional nor is it a wisdom. And what I mean by that is, look, if you don't build high-end apartments, if you don't build high-end housing, those folks, typically higher income, that you're denying housing to are simply going to move into an older neighborhood and gentrify it. In other words, for every high-end unit being built, that in general creates a unit for a low-income family. If you don't build it, that unit will get taken up by a high-income earner. And that's why, for example, when you go to places like San Francisco and you look at old housing stock, and you'll see that 75% of people living in old housing stock in San Francisco, it makes over $150,000 a year or $100,000 a year. What's driving this, of course, is that San Francisco simply has not built enough housing in the last 25 years, and you're having the gentrification problem squeezing low-income folks out. Contrast that to a place like Dallas, and I know we don't want to be Texas, I appreciate that, but contrast that to a place like Dallas, which builds lots of new housing, primarily for high-income earners, leaving lots of older housing available for, of course, lower-income families, which, by the way, a lot of families who are leaving California are moving to, because there's plenty of housing supply in Dallas. No, it wasn't built in the last 5 years, but it's there for them. It's available for them because of all the construction at the upper end, if you will, of the distribution. So building at the high end creates supply at the low end.
All right, thanks, Chris. And maybe we can wrap up with a comment more than a question. See if you have anything to say about this one. From Jim, the number of new cars in our apartment complex is surprising. You indicated that car sales are high. This seems to justify your comments about the purchase of cars. What do you think?
I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that supports the idea that the economic situation of Californians is nowhere near the dire straits that a lot of headlines would tend to suggest. And again, I go back to the basic idea that there are politics and then there's economics. And what I'm trying to do today is stay away from the politics and discuss with you the economics. And the economics suggest, again, that for Californians across the board, things are pretty darn good right now, and they're going to remain good for the next couple of years. If you're a low-skilled worker, you have more job opportunity right now than you've had in 30 years. This is good for workers. It's good, of course, like I said, for income inequality. It matches, of course, the anecdotes that you're hearing, the traffic you're seeing in the street, how busy everything is. Now, again, if you go back to politics, and this is not exclusive to either party, but in general, the shrill tone of politics at both ends of the spectrum has really, what I would call, dominated the conversation about our economy in the short run and the long run, despite the fact that these shrill comments coming out of both sides are largely just simply incorrect relative to any reasonably objective observation, conversation about the data. That's something we all have to just appreciate, this disconnect between politics and economics that exists right now. And what everybody needs to do is help our policymakers take a step back from the politics and focus on the economics. Because when you do, you're going to arrive at a different set of necessary policy goals.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to turn things back over to Tom at this point.
Well, thank you, Mike. And Chris, thank you so very much for the great presentation. And I would just encourage everybody once again to make certain that you check the CA website. We do have to communicate to elected officials at both the local and state level. And we need your assistance because I think, as Chris said, this isn't about us being shrill. This is about the rental housing industry having done its fair share, and we need to get the funds out from state and local governments as quickly as possible. So if you haven't written to your legislator, do that today, and we'll keep you apprised. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. And again, thank you, Chris Thornburg, and the study will be available on caanet.org. So thank you very much and have a good day. Bye-bye.